Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to your flip classroom, and we are going to pick right up where we left off in class talking about the Spartans, right? So now we got two major themes that we have to discuss in this flip today, right? We have to talk about, first of all, I got to close my door so I'm not just screaming about, like, Sparta and the Persian Wars, and, you know, it's really, really easy to scream about Sparta.
This is Sparta!
Nah, you don't understand how often I'm going to use that clip. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is we left off in class talking about Sparta in particular, right? We're talking about the culture of Sparta, talked about where they were founded in this little valley called Laconia at the very, very bottom of ancient Greece. We talked a lot about how, like, the culture of the very first, like, some of the earliest events of Spartan history are going to affect their culture dramatically, right? First Messenian War, it's going to lead them to actually getting these people called helots, right? Really, really quickly, just so you know, to the kids that were at our service review today. This right here is the slide that you missed, right? We talked about the Messenian War. We talked about the patron god and goddess. We talked about the huge mountain ranges separated from Athens, making their culture very, very different and unique. The Messenian War is going to make it so like all Spartan men can go off and become soldiers because they turned conquered people into slaves called helots. Do me a favor, highlight helot. Highlight helot, make it look like it's exploding, make it look like it's important, because it is. Because you need to make sure that you don't get confused between the two H words coming up on this test, right? You have helots and hoplites. And Spartans use their hoplites to go get some helots, right? The big thing about it, though, as well, is we also talked about Spartan mixed government. They had a diarchy, which was two kings, a council of ephors, and they were voted on by using a big scream and a shout and stuff like that, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is we left off in class talking about Spartan society and how it revolves around warfare, right? So all newborns, we know that were inspected, like, to make sure that they were healthy enough to be able to go off and become Spartan warriors. We talked about this when we used Abigail Toops as an example, and we were just like, oh, a little nerf was born and was really gross looking and had no arms and legs, and so we left him out in the woods. So the big thing about it, though, is yes, Spartans would leave children to die out in the woods if they actually did not meet health standards, right? Now, going forward as well, all Spartan boys, once they hit the age of 7, would be going off to military training. That's right, 7 years old. At the age of 7, military training began for young men, right? And the thing about it is you never lived at home ever again with your parents after that, right? So, like, is that not wild that literally you were just, like, taken away from your parents at the age of 7 and shipped off to military training for the rest of your natural known existence, right? Until the age of 30, they were not actually allowed to move outside of the military training base, right? And the very first second they got there, they were literally being trained from the get-go, right? They were trained out the gate the moment they got there. The second they walked in on the very first day, they actually were told to strip down, and they actually were, like, then assigned to, like, groups, because they actually trained them completely in the nude and stuff like that. As you can see, like, looking at these different little, like, etchings right here and stuff like that. So the thing about it, though, is they actually, much like the Olympics were competed in the nude, they trained these Spartan boys without any armor on, so that blades actually would cut their skin if they actually got hit, because they trained with live weapons, right? Live weapons, actually sharpened blades and daggers and spears. And so if you're training without any armor on your chest or anything like that, it's going to teach you to be very swift and, like, actually very, very quick and very, very evasive, right? And so going forward as well, the day you got there, you were actually assigned to a series of groups, right? And then every single, like, group would have the largest kid would become the leader. And the very first day, you had to, like, build your own bed and stuff like that just so you could have somewhere to sleep. And then they were in these open air, these giant open-air barracks and training complexes called, like, something, the Agoge, right? Like literally this huge building where they would do all this training. And funny little things about this big, like, this training and how it was done and stuff like that. We just spent a lot of time talking about how they would train. They would, like, literally embarrass you and, like publicly beat anyone that actually violated any of the rules. And the other big thing, too, is bullying. Do you think bullying was encouraged or actually discouraged in Spartan military training? That's exactly right, Katie Morrell. It was encouraged, right? They encouraged the boys to pick on each other to try and toughen them up. Even in Spartan adult society, they would apparently make fun of other adults if they couldn't run very far or go very fast or do anything athletic, right? So the other big thing about it, though, this is my favorite things about bullying and Spartan military training. Guess who their favorite people to call in to bully the boys was? You guys. Yeah, they loved calling in girls the boys' own age. And they would stand on the edge of the training grounds and point and laugh at them to try and toughen the boys up a little bit, right? Now, that was a big thing. Diet was also a very, very strict regimental thing. They ate twice a day, and they were typically given a soup known as black broth. And black broth was made out of blood of whatever animal that they had killed, vinegar, bone marrow, and it was all boiled together, maybe with some kind of like oats to create some kind of carbohydrates consistency, right? That is really, really gross. Could you imagine eating blood soup every single day, twice a day, for your natural known existence, right? Also, stealing. Let's talk about that real quick. Speaking of the diet and stealing part, they gave these boys this black broth, this nasty, nasty soup and stuff like that, while the officers who were training them were eating the meat from the animal that they had just slaughtered, right? The thing about it, though, is they encouraged the boys. Try and take it. Try and take it and make it so I don't catch you, right? Because they wanted to encourage them to be cunning, sneaky, resourceful, things like that, right? The interesting thing about it, though, is that you had to come up with a way to steal food if you wanted to keep eating, and this helped train and toughen up these Spartan boys as well, right? And if you got caught stealing the officer's food, you would be beaten maliciously in front of everybody, right? So now, going forward, though, at the age of 20, a Spartan man could finally get married, right? He'd get married, but he did not go out and meet this woman. How are they going to do that? Of course, it was an arranged marriage by their parents, right? It's like Married at First Sight, that terrible show that my wife loves to watch. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is they would actually be assigned by their parents to another woman, and that would become their wife, right? Interesting little thing, though. Notice this age, 20. They were oftentimes married off to girls that were about like 17 or 18, right? That's right, you ladies, y'all would have been able to marry a man in Spartan society that was actually close to you in age. So that was actually close to you in age, right? Because we know in Athens it was not that way. It was super gross. And then also you couldn't live with your wife until you were 30, right? So you literally would get married at the age of 20 and not even live with your husband until like 10 years later, right? Now, Spartan women, I always think it's so important to talk about women's place in society when we're talking about history because I'm an educator of women, right? I'm an educator of women. I'm an educator of many different types of people, and I always like to try and include those narratives in all of these stories, right? So the big thing about it, though, in general is, let's talk about Spartan women, right? So Spartan women have a way better life than Athenian women did, right? So let's start off with a cheeky little quote that apparently this philosopher gave. Aristotle, who is technically a Macedonian philosopher, but we're not going to get into that right now, who lived in Athens for quite some time, was trying to make fun of the Spartans when he said this. He said, Spartan women rule their men, right? Saying basically like Spartan women have way too much power in society. And Spartan men were like, yeah, they are there and also a very important part of our society. The Spartans didn't care about that. They liked the fact that women were heavily involved in their society because women in Sparta had far more rights than Athenian women did. They received an education. Women in Sparta were taught how to read and write. They were taught how to manage money. They were taught how to actually provide for their household. They were taught basically how to do everything, run the home, do all those things, and basically kept society going. Why would this happen? Because Spartan men were consistently away at war. So they had to be able to be strong and independent, right? And also this sculpture right here is the one that I always like to talk about. It's actually an artifact discovered from ancient Sparta. It's literally a statue of a Spartan woman exercising, right? And women would actually have to meet up together every single day in a square in their village, in their Spartan village, and they would actually have to meet up and exercise together because they believed that strong women made strong children. I think it was somebody in class, I cannot remember who it was today, that was just like, oh, like Spartan, like women would have to make stronger soldiers. I think it might have been Haley, but y'all were killing it, right? The big thing about it as well, going forward, is they ran the home. They married men their own age. They got to do so many things. They got to learn how to read and write. They got to actually run the rearing up their children, well, for boys up until the age of 7. And they also educated their daughters in the rights of Spartan women as well, right? The big thing about it, though, as well, that I love talking about with Spartan women, is the fact that they owned 30% of all the land in Sparta, right? Which some people are like, Mr. Terry, shouldn't this be half and half? I see what you're talking about. But when comparing the rights of women in Sparta to the rights of women in Athens, when Athens, it was illegal for women to own property. Spartan women owned 1/3 of all Spartan property. That's amazing. That's awesome. It's so cool. And as you can see from this painting down here, they were a very heavy part of society, right? Helping raise the children, supporting their husbands and stuff like that in war, and going forward and doing all these different things. And this right here is an interesting little artifact as well. Only 2 people in Spartan society received headstones, right? The only 2 people in Spartan society who received tombstones when they died were men who had died in battle, right? So if a man died in battle, they would literally lift him up and carry him home on his shield, right? And his brothers in arms would carry him home on his shield. They would bury him and give him a headstone, marking his grave and his sacrifice to the city. And women who died in childbirth were given headstones as well. I just think it's a very cool thing to talk about because Spartan women were literally so much more respected in their society than Athenian women were, right? So going forward though as well, within a few hundred years, Sparta's going to take over most of Peloponnese, right? But there's one little group that they never quite take over for quite some time, and it's these little guys over here, Athens, who's literally located right there. So the big thing about it though in general, right? As we can see, Spartan society is going to create a militaristic society that's going to create an entire, a foundation for expansion and control and domination, right? But now we're moving into a completely separate topic. We're moving into a very important topic. We're now going to be talking about the Persian Wars, right? Now, y'all know Persia. You've heard of some of these rulers before. You know some of the guys that we're about to talk about, and this makes it so much easier on your life to be able to actually study these different things because you know about Persia, right? But let's go ahead and dive headfirst into this, and let's look at the Persian Wars' place in the archaic time period of ancient Greece, right? And I love talking about the Persian Wars. There's a couple really great battles that we're about to talk about, so go ahead, buckle up, let's keep getting after it, right? The big thing about it, though, is when we're looking at the archaic period, you have to understand the archaic period kind of begins with the very first Olympics, right? A lot of people oftentimes get confused, and they're like, well, Mr. Terry, what were we just talking about this entire time? We were talking about the development of Athens and Sparta's culture and the growth in their power during the archaic period. These two cities, though, were actually founded during what would be called the Dark Ages period, right? And then they actually began to come to power during the archaic period. Well, they began with the very first Olympics in about 732 or 730-something BC, and that actually, interestingly enough, Rome was founded about 20 years before that. This little tiny little village over in Italy was being founded that would grow to be this massive thing. So the big thing about it, though, in general, is that the very first Olympics starts the Archaic period, right? What ends the Archaic period is considered to be the Persian Wars, right? So we just spent all this time right here talking about the growth of Sparta, the growth of Athens, the growth of Athens' democracy after their aristocracy, Sparta's very, very culture of war, right? Well, the Persian Wars were a massive set of wars, sort of, that where the Greeks would have to unite together even though they didn't like each other, right? Well, the interesting little thing about it, let me double check this. There we go, yep. So, biggest thing about it, though, they would have to unite together even though they didn't like each other. Spartans did not like Athenians, right? I don't know if you noticed that in their cultures and stuff like that, but Spartans weren't big fans of Athenians and stuff like that, right? Athenians were also not big fans of Spartans. Aristotle's over there making fun of them, even though Aristotle technically in this time period isn't really, really relevant yet, but we haven't gotten there yet, and he's also not alive. But the big thing about it, though, in general, is what's going on, Mr. Terry? Sparta and Athens were two independent Greek city-states, right? They operated solely by themselves, and if you asked them, where are you from, they would say, I am Spartan. They wouldn't say, I am Greek, right? So the big thing about it, though, in general, is why is this going on, though? Who the heck is Persia? Don't ask me that question. You know who Persia is. You know that Persia is that giant empire over to the east that was originally led by Cyrus the Great, then later on being led by Darius and Xerxes, that grew and expanded using the concept of tolerance to grow over this giant swath of territory. But look real close. That little group right there, that's the Greeks, very, very close by, right? And the Persians are going to set their sights on the Greeks at one point, right? Well, the big thing about it, though, is you also know about ancient Persia. They emanated out of ancient Iran. Their capital city is that of Persepolis, right? So, big thing about it, though, going forward, we have to also understand that let's outline these wars, right? Before we even start talking about these wars, we got to talk about what type of military action these wars were, right? So, the big thing that you got to start off with talking about is they're not wars in the conventional sense, right? When we talk about wars in general, and we talk about these particular sets of wars, these Persian wars, you got to understand that, it's very difficult to talk about because academia is kind of split on how they refer to it, right? So they're not really wars at all, right? Wars delineate the idea that, I am going to declare war on Keely Edrington, right? And Keely Edrington will then declare war on me. And then we will fight a war, and then we will sign a treaty, and then in that treaty it says what I get if I win or what she gets if she wins. But let's be honest, Keely will beat me in a war, no question about it. So the big thing about it, though, in general, she'll throw musical instruments at me. I'll just get a tuba thrown in my face. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is looking at this entire concept, you have to understand that going forward, this is not a set of wars, really. It's actually one revolt and two invasions, right? Because the Greeks never declared war on the Persians. They were defending themselves from Persian invasion. And they also had this one revolt where they kind of stepped in something that they should have stepped in, right? But the major cause is that Persia wants to keep expanding, right? Persia is not set on stopping where they were, right? They wanted to keep expanding, keep growing, and under the image of Cyrus the Great, continue to use tolerance to go ahead and move their empire even further forward. The ultimate irony is that the Greeks in this are kind of arrogant. They might have liked living under Persian rule for all they know, right? But they refused to be taken over by the Persians when this is all going down, right? And as we know, like I said, here is Persepolis. The Persians are just that empire that's expanding, and they want to keep going, right? Now, the first event of the Persian Wars, which you could call the First Persian War, is actually known as the Ionian Revolt, right? So the thing about it is, this is that one revolt and two invasions, right? When we're looking at the Persian Wars, one revolt, two invasions. This is the revolt. So the Ionian Revolt is a very important event, and it occurred in 499 BC, right? Well, what's happening with this is, first and foremost, we got to talk about there's a lot of historical bias. The actual accounts of this that we're reading, the actual accounts of the Persian Wars are coming, I believe, from a Greek historian by the name of Herodotus, right? So if a Greek historian is writing about all these events, we got some bias on our hands, right? We have to be very careful when we're analyzing events in history because we tend to assign good guys and bad guys to things, right? There are no good guys and bad guys in this situation, as y'all know, because we've studied the Persians already, right? The good guys and bad guys thing, throw it out the window. That is bias. We just want to look at what happened, right? So going forward, you need to understand the cause of this first revolt is that Persia took over this region known as Anatolia, right? Anatolia is modern-day Turkey, all right? So you know that, you should know, okay, is Turkey is located right here, very close to Greece, right? All the stuff in blue right here are going to be opponents of Persia. All of, the gray is going to be neutrals in this war and stuff like that. But this big chunk of land right here, that's Anatolia. Look how big Persia is and looming and glooming and dooming over top of this area, right? Well, they took over a very, very key important spot, right? They took over this area called Lydia and Ionia, right? Well, when this happened, okay, you need to understand that people that lived there at the time would consider themselves culturally Greek, right? They spoke the Greek language, they used the Greek alphabet, they traded with Athens and Sparta and stuff like that, and they would be a part of the culture that you would commonly call as Greek. Even though they wouldn't call themselves Greeks, they would call themselves Ionians, or they would call themselves Lydians, or something like that. Fun fact, Lydia actually invented money first, and when Persia took over them, they learned how to coin money from the Lydians, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, this little area, when it was taken over by the Persians, when it had those Greeks inside of it, is going to decide that they don't want to be under Persian rule, right? Big thing about it, though, don't forget to go the Greek colonization stuff. Now, also ignore the irony part. Now, the big part about it, though, in general, is that you need to understand who the king of Persia is during this time period. When he takes over the region of Ionia and Lydia, his name is Darius the First. And you know Darius! Darius is the one that stabbed, that was the bodyguard of Cyrus, that killed the imposter, right, after the death of Cyrus the Great and stuff like that. Married his daughter and brought himself into the Persian rulership, right? Well, the thing about it is Darius the First is the king of Persia. He's going to take over this region. He's going to impress the concepts of tolerance onto these people, and he's going to begin to rule over the people of Ionia and Lydia, right? Well, the Ionians are going to hold a massive revolt against Darius, right? And they're going to hold a massive revolt against Persian rule and decide that they don't want to be ruled over by the Persians at all. Well, the Persians are going to come in, and they're going to spend several years crushing this revolt, right? The thing about it, though, is they noticed while they were crushing the revolt. Darius noticed while they were crushing the revolt, how do these Ionian rebels have big, large vessels? How do they have Greek swords and shields, right? How do they have all these different things? Turns out that the Athenians had sent troops and ships and stuff to the Ionians for them to have this revolt. Now, this is going to make Darius very upset. And he's going to send troops and armies over a few years, and he's going to crush this revolt, right? Crushes it. Literally, kills and destroys a lot of the people that actually were doing the entire thing, were actually holding the revolt. They were burning farms and stuff like that. So he was just you know what? Let them burn. Whatever. And so he crushes this rebellion. But the thing about it is now Darius is really upset. And apparently, every single day, a guy would come up and whisper into Darius's ear, "Master, remember the Athenians. Remember their betrayal." Every day, 3 times a day, right? Literally, a guy's being like, hey, Darius, don't forget that the Athenians are jerks. Like literally telling him and reminding him of this every single day. And so Darius decides, all right, I'm upset, right? So, and he decides to launch the first Persian invasion of ancient Greece, right? And this happens from 492 to 490 BC, right? About like 7 years after that Ionian Revolt. So he decides to create and collect a massive invasion force, right? A large contingent of vessels and like soldiers, and he wants revenge, right? He wants revenge. Do me a favor, leave a space under this cause in your notes, because I do want to add one other cause to it when we're in class. Just don't let me forget. Be like, Mr. Terry, please remember to tell us the second cause of the first Persian invasion, right? So the big thing about it, though, is he wants revenge. Darius wants revenge. He is very mad. He's very angry and stuff like that. He wants revenge for this entire thing. So he launches a huge land invasion. The plan is to have troop transport ships roll up onto the banks of like a field near Athens, get off, have an army, and then go and destroy Athens and burn it to the ground, right? Now, the thing about it, though, in general, is that this is going to lead to a very all-important battle. Now, there were a few skirmishes when we're looking at this. There were a few skirmishes that happened as the Persians were on the way, and the Persians kept winning them and stuff like that. A few small battles and things like that. But the big defining battle of the first Persian invasion is that of the Battle of Marathon, right? Now, at the Battle of Marathon, there's a small field that's actually about, give or take 26 miles outside of Athens, right? And what's going to happen is the Athenians are going to be drastically outnumbered in this fight, right? Drastically outnumbered. They even called for Spartan military aid. They even were like, Sparta, please come and help us. And they actually sent a guy to run to Sparta. He ran with armor and all, like the full way, over 100 miles away. Ran all the way over there, told the Spartans, hey, can we have your help? And they're like, nah, dude, we're having like a religious ceremony right now. And Sparta refused to actually come and help them. Dude runs back, and they were like, we're on our own. And so the Athenians had to try and fight off a Persian force where they were outnumbered 2.5 to 1, right? Not like a half of a Persian soldier, but you know what I'm saying. And what they're going to do is they're going to use superior tactics to actually defeat the Persians in this battle, right? They're actually going to set their troops up on a highly elevated plain above the beaches of Marathon, right? And so Marathon Bay was right here, and this is where the Persian forces landed. They coalesced their forces together, and as you can tell, the Greeks are not nearly as strong as the Persian forces. They actually set up on this high elevated rank, and they swept down through and attacked the middle of the Persian lines, causing them to clump together in the middle, and then the Athenians would actually encircle them all the way around and use superior military tactics, hoplite military forces, and phalanx systems to defeat the Persians on this day, right? Sent them back to their boats and sent them into the retreat. And then they called to the same man that had run to Sparta over that 100 miles, and they were like, Phidippides, get over here real quick. And Phidippides was a young Persian soldier, right? Where was Sparta? He had already went and gone and asked them, come and help, and they never actually did. But Phidippides is a young courier, or a runner is what they're called, right? He actually went and carried messages for the Athenian army. And what they tell him to do, they're like, go home, inform Athens that we have won. So Phidippides takes off, right? He starts sprinting the 26.2 miles that Marathon is away from Athens, right? He gets there, he gets into the middle of the court, he's looks at the Archon of Athens, and he goes rejoice, we have conquered Nike, and then he falls to the ground and dies, right? Because look, you can't run that much, right? Remember, next time that Mr. Coach K tells you got to run in gym, just be like, dude, last time somebody did that, they died. Now, the big thing about it though in general is there also, even down here in one of the shopping centers, was a Phidippides running store, which makes me so happy and stuff like that. Because look, it's not open anymor, but still, there was this running store literally down the street from Archbishop Chappelle High School that was called Phidippides Running, and I think that's so funny. But in general, though, you got to understand a couple of things as well. When we're looking at the entire construct of this, the biggest results of that first Persian invasion is that Athens is now creating an alliance system, right? They want to create a large alliance system. Sparta, not a fan of this, right? But Athens, because Sparta didn't show up and help them in the first place, wants to create an alliance system to keep this from ever happening again, right? Sparta's not a fan of this because they already have an alliance system and they don't want Athens in it, right? And so the thing about it is Athens is going to begin to build up a massive navy, right? And so they're going to do this to try and help protect themselves because they are a bayside polis that actually has access to the sea. And they start building up these massive ships. And these massive ships are known as triremes, right? Triremes. M-E, a trireme, right? They would paint giant eyeballs on them to make them look like sea monsters, to make them look very, very scary. And then also the main weapon of a trireme to actually destroy another enemy vessel was this thing right here, a bronze battering ram that sat on the front of the ship, and they would actually use the 3 rows of oars to row this ship into another one and use that battering ram on the front to actually pop a hole in the enemy boat and sink it. Athens is going to build up a fleet of these things to try and protect from a future Persian invasion if Sparta is refusing to be in this alliance with them, right? But why didn't Darius come back? Why did Darius only do one invasion of Athens? Well, he didn't come back because he died, right? So he actually had to go quell a rebellion in Egypt, and then he eventually died. But who takes over after him? Xerxes the First, his son, right? And we're going to pick up right here when we get back to class, and we'll talk about the second Persian invasion, Xerxes, his whipping of the waters, and all that fun stuff, right? So get ready, get prepared. We got a lot of stuff to talk about tomorrow, but I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.